Hello again, and welcome to another session of Public Affairs, Public Access, brought to you by your folks at HMS TV and our wonderful producer, Mark Pirtle. I'm your host, David Hutzelman, and this is a show where we try to treat things from a political philosophy, public policy, partisan politics kind of an approach from time to time, and basically try to use a libertarian perspective on these issues. And as I've said before, I'm often asked, well, what exactly is a libertarian perspective anyway? And I just try to sum it up as that libertarians are people that are in favor of a lot less government, for a free market economy, not the crony capitalist tariff strifed economy that we're evolving into today, to a civil society where everyone's views are tolerated and different lifestyles and all have equal standing, and to a foreign policy where we basically are pretty skeptical that U.S. military might is the way to save the world. So anyway, that being the case, I have a couple of very prominent Houstonians on the panel tonight, and I'd like to introduce them. Starting on my left, we have Charles Blain. Charles is the founder and CEO of urbanreform.org, recently established public policy institute in Houston, and he can be reached at urbanpolicy.org, right?
That's it.
Okay. Keep up with him because he has all the latest news on goings on in the Houston political scene. And on my right, we have Jim Noteware. Jim is a longtime political activist, used to be the director of Houston Housing Authority, and is well-known and well-informed on Houston city politics. And so he is here to join us tonight, to comment tonight on the two. I guess we're going to try to divide up. The main issues that we're going to look at tonight are both the municipal elections coming up, which includes the mayor and obviously a slew of city council, and then also trying to devote some time to Metro. Metro, who is floating a new, highly funded, highly expensive bond and spending referendum. I think it's upwhere in the neighborhood of $7 billion right now. And so I think we're going to have some pretty sharp eyes on exactly what would we really expect from spending that kind of money in Houston anyway. So let me just start with the first type of this. And Charles's website, urbanreform.org, tries to highlight the issues that are currently in city council and in the Houston community. So Charles, why don't you tell us what you think the top issues are now in the upcoming Houston elections?
Yeah, well, I don't even know where to begin. There's so many. I mean, it's been really interesting. I think, what we're looking at now, it's and I don't know, Jim might agree, it's really different than in 2015, where I think a lot of the conversation around the 2015 municipal election, in large part due to Jim, was about unfunded pension liabilities and how that was dragging down the city and the cost of those pensions and what we need to do about them. And you haven't really heard much talk about that this time around. I think we're hearing a lot of flooding. Obviously, Hurricane Harvey happened during the course of this administration, and it's still kind of on everyone's mind. So we've been hearing a lot about flooding from the candidates and from the voters, wanting a solution and not feeling as though they've had one in the past couple of years. And then I think also another big issue, and it's kind of really relevant as yesterday was the deadline, is this whole kind of corruption and pay-to-play issue that we've heard a lot about. We've seen in both the city and the county, vendors, developers, and all these other folks getting contracts simply because they give money to candidates or give money to elected officials. And so we saw a petition that tried to curb some of that. Unfortunately, it fell a little short, but I think that's been a big issue. The whole conversation so far, in my opinion, that has dominated this election has been around corruption and pay to play and trying to kind of clean up City Hall.
Weren't there two petitions that originally were being publicized to do the pay per play thing, one by Bill King, and another one, wasn't the other one by Tony, the other Busby, the other candidate?
Right. So they both talked about doing this. I think, Bill talked about it when he announced, Tony talked about it when he announced, and they've both been kind of beating the drum about it with the intention of highlighting the pay-to-play that is going on at City Hall. Bill launched a group adjacent to Bill launched the petition drive in last month, and it's called End Pay-to-Play PAC. It was a PAC that did it. They got workers to get signatures and kind of did the whole nine. And then Tony, as far as I understand it, has not launched a petition just yet, but I did recently hear him say, or see him write that if elected, he will kind of institute this same framework of policy from City Hall rather than doing it through a petition, which is probably going to be cheaper for the voters.
I see. So he kind of backed away from the petition.
Well, yeah,
competing petition drive.
I think he saw that this one didn't work, and why try to do it again between now and election when you're trying to run a campaign? So I guess it makes more sense to wait until you're in office and then do it and make it kind of policy citywide. I think that's a little different approach.
Jim, do you have a comment on these issues?
I think Charles is exactly right. I think the two principal mayoral challengers, Bill King and Tony Busby, are focused on exposing corruption, presenting the problems to the voters.
How would you characterize corruption, Jim, as a pretty loaded word?
It is a loaded word, and the old definition of pornography, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. The problem with corruption is you can't see it. Okay. It's underneath, and it erodes and corrodes everything underneath. But the way I define it is any official, public official in the case of government, that puts his or her self-interest in front of the public that they are either elected or appointed to serve.
But don't most public officials try to show everybody how those two are really the same in a lot of cases, that their interests and the interests of the public are really dovetailing together? And so he's really, even though obviously he's working for his re-election or whatever, he's really doing what's right for the city.
Well, that's what they'd have you believe.
I know.
Right. As we used to say in Washington, follow the money, watch what they do, not what they say, and read the fine print.
Yeah, another one was a lot of people went there to do well and wound up doing good, doing good and then
wind up doing well. I think it's an interesting truism. How can people enter public service, public life with very modest means and retire very wealthy? Something happens in between. Okay, but I define a very simple definition of corruption is a conflict of interest. Bettering yourself at the expense of your constituents. But I think it's gotten so big, so pervasive, in many cases so apparent, that the public, and at least the two mayoral candidates, but I also believe some of the other more recent entrants into the mayoral race, Dwight Boykins, Sue Lovell, they have begun to pick this up. And it's a big issue when each of the candidates for city council offices, the 11 districts and the 5 at large. The talks I've had with many of those candidates, I certainly haven't discussed it with every one, but many of them I have, and they are all on the expose the corruption issue. The challenge I think that all of those candidates have is to point to very specific cases and to say, this is what happened here, and this is how either the mayor or other existing
Turner's law firm regarding the Harvey flooding settlement, would you characterize that as an issue that would fall into this category?
Yes, if it's not outright corruption, because that process apparently has been done perfectly legally, perfectly in accordance with city procurements and perfectly in accordance with federal procurements, because that is actually money that's come to the city through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And that's, you mentioned my background in the city's Housing and Community Development Department. About 95% of our budget in those days was from HUD, and so we had to adhere to HUD procurement rules, very, very disciplined. And But whether it's out and out illegal or not, it sure does not look good. It sure does not feel good.
Yeah.
All right.
And I think you make a good point before when you said don't elected officials often try to make their issues dovetail nicely with the public's, and then it pins a point Jim's making. You know, a lot of times this corruption that we're seeing, it's so apparent that something is going on, but you can't really put your finger on it. It's like, why are they voting that way when we all know this is a bad deal? Or why are they doing this when we know that this is, 2-3 times the price that it should be? And it's so apparent that there's something wrong, and you just kind of can't put your finger on it. And I think we've seen a lot of that over these past 4 years, and I think people are just frustrated. And also to Jim's point, I think the fact that we have 5 major candidates, including the incumbent, who are running as if this is an open seat race, because that's what kind of race this is, because our mayor has done so much that people are so dissatisfied with him. I think that says a lot about what we have right now and what we could see going on in the future. It's not just like it's Republicans and conservatives who are frustrated with him. He's getting challenged by members of his own party, members of his own council who were once allies with him. So I think it says a lot about the state of the city right now and the state of City Hall.
And the other thing that I think is a hallmark of good government when it occurs is transparency, open communication. And corruption usually exists when there isn't very much transparency. There's the old adage that if you're a real estate developer and you have a project in Chicago, you need to bring a roll full of $100 bills to make sure that the inspector in your project, right? The word about Houston is you don't spend the money at the job site. You just come to City Hall and you buy it wholesale, not retail. Now, please don't ask me to prove that, but that's in effect what happens. Okay. I do think, to answer your question earlier, David, back to what Charles said earlier, another big issue that is getting a lot of discussion is the city's budget problems. Mm-hmm. And there are many other aspects. Obviously, the pension issue has never been solved. It's getting worse and worse and worse, and it reminds me of everything else. When you have a problem that you can't solve, you just leave it alone and go try to solve another one. And meanwhile, it continues to fester.
And the state legislature didn't solve that problem for the city of Houston?
No, back to your point, they said they did.
Yeah, right. I mean,
it's just,
I can see what a lot of people would think had been solved.
Well, that was the public communication, but it's continuing to spiral and spiral and spiral. And every year, the deficit on the face gets larger and larger and larger and requires many more gymnastics to close the gap on a cash basis, selling assets, borrowing more. The way that you close it, you close the spending gap from a cash standpoint, not an accrual standpoint. And I don't mean to start getting technical here, but if you solve your household budget by putting extra expenses on your credit card, you really haven't solved the problem. You've just made it worse the next time. And that's what the city has been doing for many, many years. And the numbers are getting frightfully large.
Wasn't there an attempt, Charles, to try to solve this problem by, without getting too technical for our viewers, going from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan for city officials, where you can actually budget exactly how much you are going to put into the pension plan, but you're not guaranteeing how much money, given market fluctuations and all, are going to come out? And wasn't there a petition process that got some signatures to cause that to happen?
Right, yeah, there was. And what's interesting is at that same time, there were, I guess, two kind of adjacent movements to get this done. In the legislature, where they were passing the bill, there was a state lawmaker that tried to tack it on as an amendment to transition the plans to defined contribution. It didn't go anywhere, so it really wasn't talked about. But what was talked about was the petition that was filed here locally. I can't remember how many signatures it had. It was well more than enough than the minimum amount necessary to get it on the ballot. And so now we're going on probably a little over 2 years since that petition was submitted to City Hall, to the city secretary, to be validated, to switch employees, new employees, I believe it started in 2021, so any employee hired after that date, to defined contribution pension plans. And that petition is still sitting in City Hall. It has not moved. I think the last time I emailed the city secretary's office was probably like a year ago, and it didn't move at all. So not sure what happened since then. City secretary has been out for like the past year. She's been on medical leave.
Oh,
so we've
Anna
had
Russell?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. But there has been other people who have been filling that position. So there's no reason it shouldn't have been counted in the meantime. But it has not been counted, and it's just sitting there kind of on someone's
Well, there
desk
had to
probably.
be some people behind that petition. Have they kind of just dropped off from pushing that issue? I mean,
Yeah, there really hasn't been any movement from.
'cause it takes a lot to get, well, like we just saw with Bill King. It's not just a done deal to go
Yeah.
out and get 30,000 signatures from Houstonians to do something, and they went out and did that.
Right.
And yet the city hasn't counted the petitions, and the people that promoted that and funded it to whatever degree had to be funded don't seem to be prominent in the news, at least to try to get that pushed to some sort of resolution.
Yeah, so I guess what we're seeing, I mean, we've seen numerous times when you submit a petition to city halls, you better be prepared for like a year-long fight after it. You gotta, sue to get it counted, then you gotta sue to get it on the ballot, then you're gonna have to sue again because the language is probably gonna be misleading. So it's gonna be a very long process to get it done. And yeah, you have to stay on top of it, and you have to kind of continue to push the city to do the right thing, or challenge them in court to get them to do the right thing. And yeah, we haven't seen any movement from the folks who pushed a petition. I think they just kind of, submitted it, and it became kind of the public's petition, and that's been it. So we haven't, I think a lot of people have really forgotten about it over the years because it's been so long. So,
I
yeah.
haven't.
No, you haven't. See, that's why you're very good at this role here, David.
Speaking of misleading ballot language,
Yes.
don't you have some initiatives going on in misleading ballot language with the legal community?
Yes, David. My colleagues and I do. After you mentioned, didn't the state legislature help solve Houston's pension problem? After the 2017 legislative session, the state mandated that if the city wanted to sell $1 billion of pension obligation bonds, they must do so only when they secured a positive vote from the voters on the ballot box. That came and was presented to the voters on November 7th, 2017. What the voters saw in the ballot box and cast their ballots for was very different than ultimately became law. What became law was a protection for bondholders and bond rating agencies that basically said if the city did not have enough cash to pay the debt service on that $1 billion worth of bonds, that they could break the property tax cap.
Property caps being passed earlier.
In 2004, that limit the amount of increases in property taxes.
Okay.
So
they can't go back and raise property taxes just because they can't service the bonds.
Yes, but that ballot language said they could. Not the ballot language, but what became law actually said they could.
Okay.
So there was a very important one-sentence omission in what people voted for. That's the misleading ballot language. So we sued the city. The lower court decided that it did not have the authority to grant our motion for summary judgment. Now I'm not a lawyer, but I deal with lawyers all the time. And so what happened was we technically lost, and we are in the appeals process. But what the city's defense to us was, we as the city have never violated the 2004 property tax cap, and we have no intention of doing so. So the judge said, I can't grant your motion for summary judgment and to negate the bonds, but what I can do is enjoin the city from ever violating the property tax cap again without an affirmative vote of the voters. So we lost technically, but we won because we protected the property tax cap.
Right. And that property tax cap, of course, is probably Mayor White's property cap.
It occurred during Mr. Mayor
Isn't there
White's
something
first
still-
year of
Isn't there something still going on with the other property tax cap that was between Prop 1 and Prop 2 back many years ago, and Prop 2 is still being litigated through
Prop 2 is still being litigated by some very
which was
close
a more severe cap on
Yes,
all
because-
city revenues and not just property tax revenues, right?
all revenues and all expenses.
And expenses, okay.
Because the real attention should be on expenses.
Okay.
We really, as a city, we really don't have a revenue problem. Revenue's been going up, up, and up, and up. But no matter how fast they rise, expenses seem to rise even faster. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Good.
but at any rate, let me comment on one more item that both you and Charles have mentioned about the going from defined benefit program to defined contribution. In other words, a 401k or whatever. Everybody focused on the form of the pension. But what got lost in the public discussion or debates was what the level of commitment that the city has made financially to finance the pension benefits of its employees. If you go to a private sector employer, even generous ones like the big oil companies, they may have a 401k match of 3%, 4%, 5%, which would be generous in today's world. The city's pension, and this came out during the 2017 legislative session and the mayor's corridor, the base amount that the city contributes for every employee is 31% of payroll. Well, you could change to whatever form you want, including defined contribution. But if you're paying 31%, it's only a short amount of time before you're going to go broke. In other words, the pension benefits are simply too generous relative to everything else, and the city cannot afford them. And that's the ultimate problem, is size.
Yeah.
Is size.
Yeah.
So, but the public doesn't want to talk about that.
Until chickens come home to
until
roost.
something blows. And that's what's happened in a few cities.
Yeah.
A few California
Yeah, a
cities.
few California cities have. I'm not familiar with, but what happens when a city declares that they're bankrupt? They bring in bankruptcy conservators or whatever they are to try to settle who gets what? Is that?
Well, let me talk technical again. Bankruptcy court is federal court. And so what happens in one place like in California, and the precedent that those decisions make applies to Texas, even though state laws and everything may be different. But what has happened is the courts have held that pension benefits cannot be reduced in bankruptcy. So in some cases here, people in Houston say, oh, we can just go bankrupt, as if we could extinguish those pension obligations. No. What has happened in San Jose, in several other cities in California that have either gone bankrupt or gotten very close to going bankrupt, is they have had to reduce other expenses, costs.
Well, I can think of like police department, fire department,
start?
water, garbage collection.
Exactly
Those things
right.
not too exciting to talk about reducing
It's
those.
no coincidence that I grew up. I was born in Stockton, California, and I went to high school in Stockton, California. And Stockton is probably the most celebrated bankruptcy, municipal bankruptcy in the country.
So how is it to live in Stockton now?
It's been very difficult, and one of the things that Stockton had to do was eliminate all retiree benefits, healthcare benefits. So if you had been an employee of the city of Stockton and you thought once you retired the city was going to pay your health care for the rest of your life, sorry, that was all gone, right? And the other thing that happened is they absolutely had to reduce the expenditures on every other public service, including police and fire. So guess what happened when they reduced expenditures for police and fire? You had a crime wave. And I'm not kidding. It's a very, and then what happens is, you say, well, why can't you hire more policemen? Well, people really don't want to become policemen if the other members of the police force are cut, right? Because you're out there all alone, right? You don't have the backup. And so they had a terrible recruiting problem for police. It really is. Once you get into this, it cascades this negative thing. It really is interesting, but it's not going away here in Houston.
Well, and to touch upon that, I think one of the things that has yet to be discussed this mayoral election really isn't being discussed in the city at all is the retiree health care benefits. I mean, the city has, I think we have $2.5 billion of unfunded liabilities and health care benefits, so they claim we address the pensions. Some people agree, some people don't agree. But that's one area that's just untouched. We have not even begun to address those health care.
Well, are those health care benefits legally mandated and the responsibility of the taxpayers, or are they just something?
Well, right now they're the responsibility of the taxpayers.
Well, they are.
No.
Are they legally mandated?
My health care benefits, and I did work for a major oil company for 40 years. They have been somewhat reduced and going on, but they haven't been totally eliminated.
Right.
So, I mean, I was one of those people that thought, oh, health care is not included in my retirement plan. Oh, no, it's not.
Silly me.
At least it hadn't been cut off totally.
Right.
And it just, they didn't try to it wasn't that bad. But what do you say? Are we saying that the city of Houston retirees' health care benefits are kind of at risk in all of this bankruptcy, budget, whatever?
They are very much at risk.
They're just,
and unlike other pension benefits, if the mayor or the city council of Houston decided to reduce pension benefits to the city employees, they could not do so. They would need to go to the state legislature and get the legislature's permission.
But if they're going to reduce health care benefits?
They have the unilateral authority to do that.
Wow.
And now it gets a little trickier. Here's what happens next. You say to yourself, David, you and I are old enough, we understand Medicare, right?
Yeah.
So why should the city pay high insurance premiums for its retirees? Why don't the retirees do like you and I and get on Medicare?
Exactly.
Right? Answer is because many of the city employees, some departments but not others, never paid into Medicare.
I see.
Okay. So
I was curious because when I did retire, I thought, well, once I moved to Medicare, my health premium costs that my employer is still funding on some contribution, some sharing basis, would go down. Up? No, they actually went up. When I was on Medicare, I said, that just didn't seem right. I mean, well, anyway.
And to his point about the city being able to take it down, we did see a taste of that. It wasn't successful, but during the budget cycle, the budget workshop, I believe it was Councilmember Greg Travis tried to tack on an amendment that would require employees not a reduction in the benefits, but it require them to pay an inflated amount for their health care benefits. So I think they were going to make it more market rate rather than whatever sweetheart deal they have right now. And it wasn't successful, unfortunately. But we did see some attempt to address it a little bit. But I'd like to see more of a conversation from the candidates, the mayoral candidates, and even the city council candidates about what we can do to see that fixed. And I'd like to see something from the administration about what they can do to see that fixed, because it's a huge issue.
But meanwhile, it's what's called crowding out. When pension obligations or retiree obligations become so large that the city only has a finite, even though it's a big number, has a finite amount of revenue, if pensions have a priority, then everything else by definition does not have a priority. Mm-hmm. And so that's called crowding out. And all you have to do is drive along Houston city streets, and we find out every day the problem with our potholes.
Yep.
And it's not just potholes, it's deteriorating water infrastructure. The city still has a huge obligation to the EPA to clean up its sewage treatment plants. It goes on and on and on.
Okay. So, so we're going to have a whole slate of new city council are any of the city council candidates term limit protected, or?
So some of them are termed out. We have a few of them. Councilmember Ellen Cohen isn't coming back regardless of what the outcome of that election is. She's termed out. Councilmember Brenda Stardig, Councilmember Jack Christie. So there are a number of them who are term limited, and they're kind of going to be gone. Everybody else is up for re-election, and and I believe every single candidate has an opponent.
And are the issues for those races the same as the issue for the mayor's race, or do we find some difference in those? Contests?
So I've seen a little bit of a mixed bag. I think overall the issues are the same, but I do think in some of the districts you do have very, very specific issues. Like I know District E, Kingwood, and Clear Lake, their number one concern is flooding. And while that's pretty much citywide, some of the other districts have bigger issues or issues that they deem of higher importance, like maybe it's illegal dumping or crime if you're in District D or something like that. So I think when you get into some of the council districts, you see some differing and not so much what they care about, but just the priority in which they care about them. You might see some difference there, but I think by and large, crime, flooding, illegal dumping is something that's specific to a couple of the districts, but crime and flooding have been something that's just top of mind for everybody, especially crime, because it seems just to be getting out of hand. Every time you turn around, you hear another smash and grab or car break-in or something. I mean, every single day there's something new. So that's certainly top of mind for a lot of people, a lot of the candidates, and it's been kind of a top priority at a lot of the forums and council debates.
Okay. Well, let me let me take a minute and put each of you kind of on the spot for a minute here, and give a 1 or 2 minute summary on why you think one of or the other of the mayoral candidates would do a better job of addressing these issues. And I think we already know which ones we can line up here. Charles has been pretty familiar with what Bill King has been doing in his campaign, and Jim has been pretty familiar with Tony. So why don't you give us a minute or two, Charles, as to why you think Bill King would do a better job of addressing these issues?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I've obviously followed Bill for years since his first campaign, so I have a kind of more robust view of his platform and where he stands than any of the other candidates, really. And I do think that Bill brings a really interesting perspective to this. I mean, he has written for years about the fiscal issues in the city. Whether it was for local publications or his own blog, he has kind of really dove into these issues and broken them apart, looked at them, and tried to kind of come up with solutions to them. Nearly every issue that we've seen come up in recent history, whether it's been the pay parity, the pension obligation bond, the whole pension fight, everything in recent memory, he's been kind of firsthand involved in. So I think it's an interesting perspective that we have. I don't think we often get mayoral candidates who are so involved in the fight prior to actually running for office or in between running for office, whichever way you want to look at it. And excuse me. And I think when it comes to crime, that's another thing that he's been really outspoken about, and not just more recently. I think it's a general kind of global view of how we need to address crime in this city, and he spent a lot of time, especially more recently, in some of the District D, District K, some of these lower income areas where you're seeing a lot of the legal dumping, a lot of the increases in crime, and trying to kind of get a handle on what those issues mean for those people and how to address them. So I think it's the candidate I'm most familiar with, and I'm comfortable in where I would guess he would go if elected. I think I can kind of predict in which direction he would take a lot of issues, and that brings me a lot of comfort. So I am excited for that reason, and I think he does bring this kind of knowledgeable and well-researched view to a lot of city issues, and I'm excited about that. The one area where I think I wish he would take kind of a more well, actually, I wouldn't even say a more in-depth approach, but I haven't heard much about it from many of the candidates. A few of them I have, but it's this kind of a new approach to crime where they kind of embrace folks who are getting out of incarceration and coming back into the city, trying to find them new employment and new jobs and kind of plugging them into the framework of the city. That isn't something that a lot of candidates have talked about. Bill hasn't talked about that yet, but some of them have, and I'm excited to see that become more a part of the conversation, because I think that's incredibly important when it comes to dealing with crime. So another thing that I wish more candidates would talk about is housing. I don't think we've had a robust conversation about housing or affordable housing in this city, and that's kind of a knock to all the candidates. No one has spoken a lot about that. But yeah, so I mean, generally speaking, those are the issues. I think he has a very, very rounded view of what it's going to take to fix these issues. Well researched. He's done this for years, and I'm very comfortable in the direction that I know or I believe he would take things if elected.
Okay. Jim, how about another perspective on this?
I think Tony, who is a recent participant in city affairs, Bill has been through this once before, Charles and I have both worked with Bill in the past. I think Bill would be a wonderful mayor. Tony also would be a wonderful mayor. Tony brings several real attributes to this. The first one is Tony is an incredible listener. Tony is going all around the city. He is listening to people from all walks of life. And I can tell you from working with Tony, since he declared his candidacy approximately 6 months ago, he internalizes it. He listens to what people need, and he's trying to figure out solutions. The other thing Tony does is he really engages with people, with audiences, and he has made campaigning fun. He's made campaigning aggressive. He makes a sport out of all of this. And of course, the thing that endears me to Tony is he is not bashful about his criticism of the status quo. And
well, he's the, if you might, I don't know if we want to make any analogies here, but he's kind of, at least I looked on him as kind of a disruptor to city politics.
Oh, yes, and I think he would be very complimented, or he will be when he hears this conversation in your description. No, he's very happy to shake things up, wants to shake things up. And let's just talk about the crime issue. Tony's main criticism of the status quo is the corruption, but right behind it is crime, the rise in crime. He won't tolerate that, and he also won't tolerate poor leadership. I would say Tony wins Inauguration Day. He will announce leadership from afar that will come in and change the way Houston does business. I can tell you, and I am by no means an expert on public safety or criminal justice techniques, etc., but I can tell you that Houston is way behind cities like New York that have embraced new crime prevention techniques. In other words, don't wait till a crime happens and then try to go solve it. Try to anticipate when, where, and how crime is likely to happen and be there before it happens. A lot of people don't realize in the 20 years, the 8 years of Mayor Giuliani and the 12 years of Mayor Bloomberg, murders in New York City went down 80%. 80%. They went.
Murders or mergers?
Some would say they're the same thing, but I'm teasing David. But murders went down from over 2,400 at the end of Mayor Dinkins' administration to less than 400 in the last year of Mayor Bloomberg's. And 1 week in early June, there were only 3 shootings in the entire city of New York. In other words, when you concentrate on reducing crime, you can make a difference. And those techniques...
Concentrating on crimes meaning more than just locking up people.
More than just locking up people, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So anyway, I think we are in for some interesting change, long overdue in Houston.
Okay, very good. Well, okay, we may have kind of summed up our interest in Houston city politics. Let's switch to another metropolitan organization, more commonly known as Metro, the Metropolitan Transit Authority of Harris County, which is kind of a semi-autonomous government agency on its own, at the behest of the state legislature as opposed to the city legislature, although the city does have some implications and control over Metro in terms of their ability to appoint a certain number of board members. I think it's not a majority necessarily, or is it a majority still? Is it 5-4?
Yes, the city still has 5. Has 5
so they're still
appointments.
in charge of it. But I mean, I think Metro is something we really need to take a very hard look at, and I've done that for quite a long time, going all the way back to the 2004 referendum, which brought light rail to the city, which I still can characterize as a political success and a transportation failure. But looking at the data from Metro, and you can look at this yourself if you want to go to the American Community Survey, which is a subset of the U.S. Census Bureau, and look online and see what, there's a category there called Journey to Work, which will show you how many people use mass transit to go to work. You don't have to look at Metro's numbers. One thing about Metro, they like to focus on their boardings. Well, you know, when you put light rail in and discontinue all the bus lines that used to run those routes, well, then you have doubled the boardings for your mass transit system, and you point to it. Oh, look at all the boardings are up for our system. Well, no, they're not up. You just transferred a lot of people and caused one link trip to be called multiple boardings.
Excuse me, David, and by doing that, you've actually made the trip worse.
Oh, yes,
for
you have,
for the traveler.
Most of the travelers hate transfers when they get into something. So, well, I just have to put in this pitch. I said, you know, well, what do you do? You can look at these statistics online, and since 2005, between 2005 and 2015, Metro ridership, at least in Journey to Work, and people that commute, and I think that's where most people are concerned about congestion and other things, or the rush hour in the morning and not. The Journey to Work by Houstonians in the Metro area has decreased by 20%. 20% fewer people are taking mass transit to work than were back in 2005. And so what's Metro's answer to this problem? Expand. We need more. We need more rail lines, and we'll replace more bus lines because our business is falling. Well, yes, it's falling because transportation by private car is usually twice as fast as going to work on Metro, and with the exception maybe of park and ride bus lanes that use high occupancy lanes coming to downtown. That's one area that is probably competitively priced. But otherwise, if you're trying to go to downtown or go to work, you're going to spend about twice as much time as if you had a private automobile. So Metro has this, I'm not sure whether this thing called Metro Next, which is there, whether it's been totally documented, but it is in the realm of numbers that I've seen, about $7 billion to continue to increase these light rail lines with ridership that is going to be very disappointing from their standpoint, as it was back in 2004, as ridership in public transit across the country considers to decrease, except maybe in New York and Chicago and San Francisco, where there's a lot of different geographical implications are being played out. But there's no reason that anybody is going to be using more transit in Houston than they are now. So let me just go around these our guys here and talking about the issue. They're not talking about, I don't think, any increases in taxes, because they're getting $300 and $400 million a year from the taxpayer. We unfortunately weren't looking very hard when Metro passed a 1% sales tax way back in the 1990s, thinking, oh, we're going to increase congestion. And by any measure, you can look at the Harris County registrations for automobiles. It's far outpacing anything that Metro is even in their wildest dreams forecasting as being transit riders. So obviously we're going to continue to be had to deal with congestion. And so this idea of spending $7 billion more to transfer people from fairly functional bus routes to this golden-plated rail transit or streetcar transit, which Houston gave up 90 years ago, actually, to tear up all the lines, is just unbelievable. It's on edges on insanity. But I'll let my other two panelists comment on that, because I don't want to seem too overpowered here. But Charles, you want to say anything about Metro? I know you've had some posts to your blog about people who have been critical of Metro.
Yeah, so I think what we're looking at is this kind of overall I think it's called the long range plan that runs up $7 billion, and then the upcoming bond issuance, if I'm not mistaken, is going to be like 3.5 or 3.3, something about half of the overall long range plan. That's very expensive. I mean, very, very, very expensive to get people out of their cars. And I think that's the problem, is that a lot of people in Houston like to drive. I like to drive because taking the bus or walk, I mean, if I'm going downtown, I don't mind taking the train every now and then, but if I can take my car, if I know there's going to be parking, I'm always going to opt for taking my car because it's easier, especially in the Houston heat. So it's a very expensive proposal to get people out of their cars. But we did have a blog post most recently from a friend of mine, Connor Harris with the Manhattan Institute, and he was kind of analyzing their new planned line down to Hobby Airport, and the costs were just astronomical for the line itself, and then the projected ridership was
close to $900 million, if I remember.
Yeah, so I mean, it's unaffordable and it's unnecessary, and if you're not going to have the ridership, if the ridership isn't begging for that, if you don't have people saying we really want this line so that we can get to and from Hobby, well then why bring this? Why try to force it on people when it's going to go unused? And I think that's the big problem. It's that they're not doing what the kind of motorists and what the people moving about the city really want. They're doing what they want to see the future of the city look like. And they had an interesting conversation at their board meeting the week before last, where they were
board meeting is
the Metro board.
Metro board.
Yeah,
meeting. Okay.
and they were contemplating whether or not this Washington Ave corridor line was going to get put in this new upcoming Metro Next bond, and they decided against it. And if you listen to the conversation, it's like, well, they said no one wants it. They said that the community wasn't responsive to it. There's really no good reason to it, and they keep looking around like, well, is there any reason to do it? Like, is anyone going to speak up and say why we should do this?
Didn't a young lady by the name of Lauren Barish have a private line that went up and down Washington Avenue, shuttling people between?
I don't know about that.
It's called the Washington Shuttle or something.
Really?
She went in and started that.
Well, we should have more private companies doing that. I think that would work a lot better. I mean,
right.
Integrate Uber and other things in there so that they can kind of pick up that last mile and get people to and from their destination rather than having, the public fund everything. But so they decided against the Washington Ave line, and then in this conversation, they say, well, maybe we can work with some of the other districts and kind of get a streetcar in there or something. So they don't really know what needs to be there, and I think that can go for a lot of the places that they're laying rail or doing certain things. And
that sales tax revenue makes you just think
you got to spend it somewhere.
Somewhere we got to spend this.
It's already
burning a hole in your pocket.
It's already spoken for, really.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the thing. Jim, would you like to pile on?
Sure, happy to. There's so much to say, so little time. The first thing is, if the Houston metro region had an incremental $7 billion or even $3.5 billion, should we spend it on more empty rail line operations or more empty buses? I don't think so. If we had that money, we should spend it on mitigation for future flooding risk, right?
Yeah.
Everybody that is looking at the flooding question says, we don't have the money. Ed Emmett, in his last term, did a yeoman's job of getting the voters of Harris County to approve $2.5 billion. He worked very hard. $2.5 billion relative to what the Army Corps of Engineers says is a $30 to $35 billion tag to fix our future flooding risk. Why should we be spending money on empty rail facilities when we have so much to do on flooding? That's number one.
The funny thing between flooding and Metro is that, as you probably remember, rail can't run in more than 3 inches of water. So they have to shut the rail line down if there's any flooding.
You get electrocuted.
Whereas buses, can wander around where the flooding isn't and other things. But
well, now you've gone to the second. I think anybody who reads or listens knows that we're within somewhere between 5 and 10 years of a massive change in transportation called autonomous vehicles, and it's coming very, very quickly. Why? And in every walk of life, I think society and the economy is all moving toward more flexibility. Look at Uber, Lyft. Look at different transit routes that you can go in by driving. Shouldn't we be trying to figure out more flexible modes of transportation? The ultimate rigidity is a rail line. physically, and it rigidifies neighborhoods, cities, everything else, and they don't work. Linear rail lines by themselves don't work. In the big cities of the Northeast or in Europe or in Asia, they work on grids or interlocking. People aren't going to walk more than about 2 blocks for a rail line. That's why our ridership in Houston goes down, because they don't work functionally, which then leads me, they don't work financially. When Metro says we want the authority to sell $7 billion worth of bonds, they don't ever say, how are those bonds going to be repaid? And they all say, oh, we have the sales tax. Well, on the existing system, they now incur several $100 million per year in operating shortfall, which is funded by the sales tax, right? Yep. In other words, that sales tax is fully consumed. You double the system, you add all these new rail lines, where does that shortfall come from, right? It's like the old adage, well, I lose a little bit on every sale, but I make it up on volume, okay? So, or the other way is, how do you go to bed dumb and wake up smart? I don't think Metro can. And what's really a shame is it's a fraud on the people. Our population, our people that need certain public services and certain public improvements, and they're being hijacked into a Metro proposal that really nobody wants. I don't get up every morning. I get up every morning and I hear people crying about flooding and flood risk, especially when we've had last 4th of July and several other minor rainstorms and floods. People are still getting hurt. But I don't hear anybody saying, oh, we need a rail line to the airport. In the era of Uber and Lyft, $15 downtown from Hobby Airport in 15 minutes, how could rail ever compete with that?
Yeah, it can't.
It can't. And why should we try?
Exactly, just so we can spend the 1% sales tax and continue the contractor crony capitalism that's going on with, all that construction.
What's interesting, you mentioned the spend the sales tax. The state legislature proposed an additional 1% and then 2% sales tax this year, one for the state and one for other local governments. And it didn't get very far. The citizens of Texas do not want to pay another cent or two sales tax. Yeah. And even if they did, it's a very regressive tax.
Right.
And especially one of the most, I think, ill thought out of the lines is the one that they want to take to the airport. Most people don't go to the airport from an activity center, as Metro likes to call them, or downtown. People go to the airport from their home. You know, they're going to go somewhere and whatever else. And you're not going to, well, I don't know why you'd want to schlep your bags on taxi or something so you could get to a rail station, so you could take twice as long to get to Hobby Airport as you could if you drove. Interesting that they're talking about going to Hobby. Maybe that's because it's a little closer to the inside than going to Intercontinental. A couple of interesting statistics that I'm aware of from the past. The largest airport service from mass transit in the country is Reagan National Airport in Washington. Okay. And they have 10% of the flights coming in that will wind up on last rail. Every other airport in the country is 2% or under. So there's no major demand. Now, the Visitors and Convention Center would probably like to have an airport from, or a rail line from Hobby to go downtown, so all the people that are coming in for conventions are would be serviced, and maybe that would spur some convention business. But they're staying away from Intercontinental, I guess probably because it's a longer line, but I remember back from 15 years ago when they were talking about putting a line to Intercontinental, and the guy said, one of the people were saying, well, we don't want to do that because the city parking lots up there are the things that are making money for Intercontinental Airport. And if we take away people that are going to park their cars up there, we're going to have a disaster when trying to keep maintaining the airport up there. So we don't want mass transit to go to the airport. Things you don't really usually think about
Right.
when you're talking about having mass transit. You think it's a great
But David, part of the story that they don't tell you is for many, many, many years, there was a bus line from Greenway Plaza to Intercontinental Airport.
And the Galleria.
Yeah, and it was a beautiful bus.
Doesn't work anymore?
No, they closed it because nobody rode it.
Oh, really? Oh.
No, seriously, they did terminate that service because it had no ridership.
Yeah. Well, the whole idea, I think if you look at, I might tell our viewers, you might look at a place called HoustonBlog.net, which is written by our friend Neil Meyer, who talks about metro issues from time to time, but talking about the whole faulty reasoning behind connecting the metros, trying to connect activity centers. Well, very few people go between activity centers. You're not going from Greens Point because you want to get down to the Galleria or somewhere else. People go from their homes to activity centers.
That's right.
Not from one activity center to the other. And so connecting all the activity centers, while it's there's a lot of people there that need transportation. Yeah, they are, but they're not going to other activity centers. Right. They're trying to get back home after they work. So it's just a very weird kind of a way to try to justify something. And I really hope that our viewers can take a hard look at the metro thing and just ask themselves how many times they've used public transit in the last year. And not to say that there's not any demand for public transit. There's a lot of people that are transit dependent. They can't drive a car or they can't afford a car. And, they may need to get a job, and there's still, I think, some rationale for providing some of that. Although, I think if you did a hardline budget analysis, you could show that Uber carpooling will bring anybody in Houston to where they want to go cheaper. All the metro riderships cheaper than what it's costing taxpayers today. It's amazing how just this peer-funded, peer-provided transportation system that Uber and Lyft and anybody else has available can really do a much better job and get you from exactly where you are to exactly where you want to go, and not, take a bus to go here and then you can get on light rail and then you can transfer to something else and take an hour to get where you want to go instead of the 20 or 30 minutes that it would have taken you if you had a car or if you had called Uber or Lyft. So let me, I guess, on that optimistic outlook, let me wind down our session here and thank our two public policy experts that I have here. Any closing remarks, Charles, that you want to say? We're in the wrap stage. But,
I mean, not much. I thank you for having me. And if anybody wants more information, they can visit urbanreform.org. That's about it.
Hey, great. Okay, Jim, you want to put a plug for anything?
No, the only thing is to ask each voter to do their homework, think carefully, become engaged. There's plenty of information out there. Ask the hard questions. All of the candidates are readily acceptable. They're all very nice people.
Should we ask them to keep on the lookout for any political developments counting you as a candidate somewhere around?
Yes, good. Thank you, David. And I filed my paperwork earlier this week to run for Congress in District 7.
District 7, okay, well.
That's the former John Culberson seat, now held by Lizzie Fletcher.
Okay, let me encourage our viewers to look at both of those websites and keep your eye on Jim as an upcoming candidate in District 7. And thanks for joining us now, and hope we'll see you again next month with some other pertinent issues about the city of Houston and its future. Thank you.